Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Foster an Inclusive Culture for Your LGBTQ plus staff and partners. My name is Yvonne Sims, Programs Manager for Candid based in Atlanta. I'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way and posing them during the Q&A. I would like now to introduce our wonderful speaker today and hand over the controls to Amanda Cole. I'll tell you now that Amanda is a great presenter and we're so glad to have her with us again. She did a workshop with us in October actually, and we knew we had to have her come to talk about this really important topic with us. And without
Mhm.
further ado, Amanda.
All right, fantastic. Well, I always like to start my sessions with a poster. These are called the One World posters from Teaching Tolerance, which they recently changed their name, I think, to Learning for Justice. I'm sorry, I can't totally remember, but I use a lot of Teaching Tolerance resources. My background is as an educator, and I just want to set the tone for what we're going to do here. So I love Kid President, and I hope you do too. And that if you don't know who Kid President is, just go to YouTube and watch for a little bit. I guarantee you it'll give you some inspiration and upliftment when you need it. And what we're really looking at here today is this idea of a platinum rule. You know, when we think about the golden rule, which encourages us to treat people how we would like to be treated, that still puts our own preferences, life experiences, and worldview in the center. When we're really wanting to create experiences and places of inclusion and belonging, that requires that relationship building, that trust, and the knowing of another person, another community, another culture, of how they would like to be treated, to be curious about norms and preferences and needs. And so this also gets to this core fact that we're all awesome, right? What some people think about this as being divine or any other way, but we all have inherent awesomeness. So what we're doing here today is you don't have to have it all figured out. None of us do. But the fact is that you're awesome. And when we seek to treat people as if they are awesome and in respect to their awesomeness, we're going to be steps closer to having better communication and creating more inclusive organizations and places. So part of what we'll be doing today, in about an hour of our time, and then we're going to leave time for Q&A, is I'm going to walk through a little bit of LGBTQ history, because knowing our history and the current impacts that it has on today is critically important as we continue to move forward and foster understanding. We'll also take some time to look at a little bit of like the legal kind of societal landscape of how it is that we move throughout the world and what challenges and barriers there might be. Also going to break down, what does LGBTQIA+, what do these letters mean? What's the importance of these concepts and words? And then finally, we'll wrap up and we'll talk a bit about some simple steps and suggestions I have for you to create that inclusive space for your colleagues, but also the communities and the individuals that you seek to serve and support. So a bit about Plexus. Again, my name is Amanda Cole and my pronouns are she, her. I have the distinct privilege of being the executive director of the Plexus LGBT and Allied Chamber of Commerce and our Education Foundation. It's through our Education Foundation that we research, develop, and design curriculum, training, and educational programs such as this. And one thing I want to let you know is I'm here in Ohio. So we're the LGBT Chamber in Ohio, mostly in Northeast Ohio. But wherever you are, I guarantee that there's another LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And so they also have programs that are maybe focused on business development, but always around building allyship, networking, connection, and often will have diversity, equity, and inclusion programs such as what I am bringing here today with you all. Okay, so a bit about history. Language and history play a crucial role towards creating change, right? We understand that beyond a given month, Black History Month, Women's History Month, Hispanic Awareness Month, we have to be engaging, learning, and growing and expanding our worldview if it's not our lived experience. But, these months can do something to focus us in. So regardless of what kind of organization you have, I hope that you can have an awareness that June is LGBT Pride Month and October is LGBTQ History Month. And so what I want to walk through here now also really is trying to emphasize that lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, transgender, asexual, pansexual people, we've always existed, and we represent everybody. So we can be any nationality, ethnicity, race, ability, gender, right? Economic status. So many times LGBTQ folks are managing multiple identities at one time. So I'm just going to walk a bit through this. And just like in schools, teaching history from multiple vantage points is an important part of just creating an equal world and expanding that worldview again. And it can also inform the ways that we design programs and that we shape our workplaces. So again, I talked about June being Pride Month, and that really started in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. And the Stonewall riots were in reaction in response to a standard process of bars and locations being, police would go in and raid them, and you would be arrested. You'd be charged with a felony, any number of different things depending on the state or ordinance that you were in. This really came in the 1950s and 1960s after World War II, which was interesting. And under McCarthyism, the policing of expression and LGBTQ identities were seen as a perversion and were seen as a reason to be arrested. People could be fired. Your mail was surveilled. Somebody could come into your home and arrest you for this. And so this obviously impacted people's livelihoods, their sense of well-being, relationships with family. But in 1969, people at Stonewall Inn stood up and didn't back down. And from that, in the next few years after that, we had different pride marches and demonstrations and different community organizing efforts that happened around that. So up until 1963, homosexuality was in the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So basically it was classified as a mental health illness. It was an illness. And this is another reason why for many of us in the LGBTQ community, we don't like the word homosexual or homosexuality. Well, there's nothing innately wrong with it. It's not mostly our word of choice. Now, I know some gay people who do use the word homosexual or homosexuality, and that's fine. With many things, what we need to do is I'm sharing some basic overviews and things about our community, but we always meet people where they are. So if somebody tells you that's their preferred word, you can be curious about it, but you're going to use that word to refer to them. It's similar between the distinction between Black and African American. If my friend says they prefer the term Black, then I'm going to use that term. If they prefer the term African American to describe their identity and their experience, of course, that's what I'm going to use. So up until 1973, this was something that, again, people were put into mental health institutions for this. But one thing I think is really interesting, I just want to share here with you. Maybe many of you are like me, and Friday at 8:30 a.m., you find yourself parked in your driveway if you're actually commuting or at your place of work, and you're having to take a moment because you just listened to StoryCorps, right? So StoryCorps is an NPR program, and it fosters communication and conversations between people. Well, that project started because David Isay, his father, was Richard Isay, who was instrumental in having this removed, from the DSM. But the thing is that Richard Isay, he was a closeted gay man. So he was married to a woman and had children and just never lived his full life and came out as himself until he was 52. And then he married his partner in 2011, but then died in 2012. So David Isay was just really trying to make sense of his father's life and trying to understand why he didn't come out sooner. And from that, the StoryCorps Out Loud project was created. So I really encourage you to explore the Out Loud project. It can be a great way to engage with the stories of LGBTQ people. And it's through stories that we often have a better understanding of what somebody else is experiencing in their life. It can be an important first step to diversity, right? And expanding our worldviews. In the 1990s, I think we have Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Defense of Marriage Act. And what I like to talk about these is because it's not just that there's a lack of federal protections, which there are. So as a lesbian, I am not a protected class. Whereas as a woman, you can't discriminate against me based on my gender, right? You can't discriminate based on ability, based on race and ethnicity. But LGBT has yet to be included. So we'll talk more about how that manifests in maybe your community because of those lack of federal protections. The other part of this is it's not just the lack. There are often legislation and laws and policies put in place specifically to disallow LGBTQ folks from having the same rights and protections. Not special, not extra, just the same rights and protections. And so that's what Don't Ask, Don't Tell did. It meant that if you were gay and in the military, nobody was asking, nobody was telling. Sounds great. But right? Supposedly, but we know that we know the impacts of segregation. We know the impacts of keeping people and excluding people out, no matter how benign a policy like Don't Ask, Don't Tell seems to be. Because the fact of the matter, you could serve your country and then say you were injured overseas in the war. Well, when you came home, your partner, your life partner, was treated as a friend and was not treated as family. And that's just not the way to treat people, let alone the fact of being able to have access to benefits. And Defense of Marriage did that as well. So it disallowed me from marrying my wife. And that also meant that if she was injured and at a hospital, I wasn't counted as family. Maybe I wouldn't be able to see her, right? She wasn't able to be on my insurance. We weren't able to file for taxes. So many times the marriage equality movement really came down to money. It came down to the fact that the government was disallowing people from having equal access to basic needs and necessities. When we think about Ellen as a talk show host, common name, right? People know who Ellen is. But she came out in 1997 and it derailed her career. And coming out and just being who you are and letting people know who's important in your life as a partner shouldn't be a big deal. And fortunately, it is a bit less. We do have more acceptance around orientation. So what's interesting to me is that at this time when we had Don't Ask, Don't Tell and Defense of Marriage and Ellen was coming out, Matthew Shepard and James Byrd both lost their lives. Matthew Shepard was a white, young gay man, and James Byrd was an African-American man, both in the South. They were brutally murdered, and their attackers, the men who did this to them, said that it was because of their identity. For James Byrd, because he was an African-American man, and for Matthew Shepard, because he was gay. Up until this point, hate crimes or a hate crime would only protect if you were trying to participate in a federal activity like voting. So mostly through the Matthew Shepard Foundation, we now have what we know as the Hate Crimes Act, which is that any individual who maims, harms, murders another person based on their identity, and that can be proven, there's different ways in which they're tried and punished, essentially. So it really expanded that, and it brought conversation about identity and the fact that different groups of people are targeted because of who they are. Okay. And so then we know that marriage equality was granted, and in 2020, the Supreme Court heard basically about Title VII that protects around workplace discrimination. So there's no federal protection for workplace discrimination. And so what that means is I could be fired for being a lesbian unless my town or my state passed laws or my town passed an ordinance. And fortunately, what the Supreme Court found was that the protection of gender or sex as a class did protect lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and other orientations and transgender people from being fired. But that does not expand to other places within for protections. So when we think about how this might show up, both in history and because of experiences now, anytime somebody has been marginalized, put to the outside, their identity has been deemed less than, they've been able to be arrested just for who they are. We can think of different groups that this happens to and different identities. Or if it's just benign neglect and there's an inability to equally access the same basic human needs, it has a generational and long-term impact on entire communities. So these are the stresses that your colleagues could be experiencing and bringing into work. If you're a food pantry, you're serving LGBTQ folks, even if you don't know. Many times we don't know someone's orientation or even their gender identity, if they're trans or non-binary. But these are the layered ways in which identity and oppression can impact quality of life. And we see that this parallels, and we know COVID has really brought to light the disparities that happen when people are marginalized, when they're pushed to the outside. And this parallels ways that we see this happening in communities of color, for instance. So one thing that's really important to pay attention to is that for transgender people, the likelihood of being unemployed or underemployed because of discrimination or a lack of access to resources is 2 times that of the greater majority. All people based on orientation, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people also are experiencing these discriminations, but for transgender people, it's 2 times as likely to happen. If you're working with homeless youth, you probably already know this. We believe that 40% or more of youth who are homeless become homeless because they have come out as trans or as lesbian, gay, or bi, because of their orientation, that they lose their family of origin and they become homeless. For older LGBTQ adults, if we think back to 1960s when people were arrested and charged as felons for being gay, that had a real impact on the earning potential and the overall well-being for older adults. Also, that generation is more likely to have a frayed relationship with their family and to have lost the connections of family of origin. And as we age, having nieces, nephews, and whatnot, that's extremely important. This might be one of the reasons that you hear within the LGBTQ community the term chosen family. Many times we lose, if not forever, if for a certain amount of time, our relationships with our family. And so we choose family, we choose new siblings, we choose new aunts and uncles, in that way, and we make meaning in place. In many ways, I mean, humans were a pack, we're a herd kind of, species. And also what I was saying about the equal protections. So unless you are a state that has specific protections for LGBT people, and you would be one of these states here. So 28 states lack LGBT equal protection laws. So in Ohio, we don't have those protections, but in the county where I work, we have full protections. We put a special ordinance in place, and special only because it had to be an ordinance. It's not special as in far as rights, that says you cannot fire somebody for their orientation or their gender identity. You can't disallow them a place to live or not serve them. Of course, there are exceptions many times for religious freedom, for religious rights. So what this might be happening as you're thinking about where you are is, does your city have these protections? Or could I go to rent a new house or to rent a house and be told by the landlord when they find out that that's not my friend, but that's my wife or my girlfriend, that I don't I don't rent to lesbians. I don't believe in that. I'm not going to rent to you. And what kind of instability, what kind of stress does that create for your colleagues and those that you serve? So one thing that you can do as an organization is know, is there a protection ordinance? Does your state have legislation that provides equal protection? And if not, how can you advocate around that? We often know that 501c3s, we have to be careful how we advocate. But the fact of the matter is, having equal protections for people with regards to employment, public accommodation, being able to get a loan and rent and buy a home, it's good, right? There's a return on investment. We know that people, when they're able to be out, when they're not worried about being discriminated against because of their orientation, their productivity goes up by 40%. And so if you're in one of these areas or these states that don't have equal protections, you probably have something similar to what we have, which is called Ohio Business Competes, which is over 1,000 businesses and organizations that have signed on to say, please pass equal protection laws, because it helps us attract and retain talent. It helps us better care for our employees and our stakeholders and the constituents that we serve. And we know that policies don't fix everything. We know the civil rights movement, the civil rights protection, the Voting Rights Act, we know that that did not stop discrimination from happening. We know that there's still work to do to ensure that people are having equal access and that discrimination is not disallowing them from that access. But a policy does go a long way to shift and say, as a culture, as an organization, as a nation, we believe that people shouldn't be discriminated against. So you might have some questions here. Matthew Shepard was killed in Wyoming. Thank you, I see that in there. I did place Wyoming in the South, which is not fair, and I think says a lot more about my geographic reference being from Ohio. And so I'm sorry to everybody from Wyoming. I know I don't like it when people are like, Ohio, isn't that up the glove-shaped state? And we're not, because that's Michigan. No offense to Michigan. Okay. So now we're going to take just a bit. I mean, we could run a 2-hour training just on orientation and gender identity and expression. We can't not talk about it because language is critically important. And within the LGBTQ community, we kind of create words and language because they don't exist, right? We haven't been allowed to exist, or the understanding or the overall, the majority social norms that explain relationships and that explain gender are limiting and they're not expansive enough. And I like to remind people that sometimes learning new language or understanding why somebody might like a certain word can sometimes feel challenging or overwhelming or confusing, and that's okay. We don't have to have it all figured out, but we do need to show up and treat people with the awesomeness that they have. And also remember, humans create words all the time. We create new stories and meanings. It's a beautiful part of our evolution as beings. It's pretty great. Besides, thumbs, I think it's one of the best parts of probably how we've evolved. So try and keep an open mind, right? So we use this gender unicorn. This comes from the Trans Student Center, and they have a lot of other resources that are there. So when we're talking about gender is personal. It's deeply personal. It's how we see and understand ourselves, and just like many other aspects of identity. Sexual orientation is interpersonal. It's who we are physically, emotionally, or romantically attracted to. It's kind of that more external aspect of how we form relationships, usually intimate partnerships, sexual or non-sexual. Our gender is an interrelationship. It's a relationship with ourself, and it's an interrelationship between 3 dimensions, between the body, between identity, and then social gender. So sex and gender are often used interchangeably, man, woman, male, female. So we know male, female is sex, quote unquote sex, and gender is boy, girl, man, woman, neither, both, non-binary. We're going to get into that. So they're connected, but the 2 terms are not equivalent. when we are born, there's usually 2 sex determinations. In some places, there's a third, and it's usually as male, female, and that is assigned at birth based on outward genitalia. Biologically and physiologically, though, there's more than just 2 sexes and more than just 2 genders. And most of us are living in a society where we see sex as a binary concept, just 2 rigidly fixed options. There's male or female. That's based on a person's reproductive anatomy or functions. But there are intersex traits biologically that demonstrate that sex actually exists across a continuum of possibilities. So first, what we're trying to challenge here and be more open around is that the binary isn't true, that there's more than just 2 sex designations and 2 genders. So what happens often, how most of us are probably experience this, is sex is assigned, and then we presume, the adults around the child, we presume the child's gender based on that sex assignment. And for some people, this causes little or no concern, no further thought, because the gender aligns, the gender that society has given aligns with the gender-related ideas and assumptions associated with their sex. So that would be me. Aside from not understanding why I wasn't allowed to play baseball and I had to play softball instead, being assigned female at birth and my gender identity as a woman or a girl, they aligned. And so I'm cisgender. Cis in Latin is on the same side of. So it's in the same side. But a person's comfort in their gender is related to the degree that those 3 dimensions of body, identity, and social gender feel in harmony. So the other thing about gender is that we, humans, we created this. We created the expectations, the norms, the rules, right? Who's allowed to do what? Who's allowed to say what, act, and all those different things. Those are gender norms. And they differ across region, across culture, across time. They are actually rather fluid and change. And it also says that there's only one way or another, but probably even in your own experience, and have had experiences, if you're cisgender like me, where those rules and expectations didn't always align up with how you understood yourself. Identity, gender identity, is a personal identity. And where we see this on the unicorn, it's the rainbow, it's the mind, right? So the gendering of our bodies, it affects how we feel about ourselves, how we perceive and interact with others, and how they perceive and interact with us. The relationship between our gender and our body goes well beyond reproductive functions. And research increasingly points to the fact that our brains, again, our mind, the unicorn bubble, rainbow bubble there, our brains, our mind play a key role in how we personally experience our gender. So, especially according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, by age 4, most children have a stable sense of their gender identity. It's an inherent aspect of our makeup. We don't choose our gender, and nor can we change it. But this is where, if you have somebody in your life who is non-binary, who is transgender, you may be familiar as an ally to them, the way that how the words can grow over time, how that person chooses to communicate this deeply personal aspect of themselves outward, right? That can change over time. The naming of one's gender, it's complex and it's evolving. So we always encourage there's no one right way, and to just try to show up and be patient also. It can really take a person, even if they have that strong sense of self, as we're seeing at the age of 4, it can take somebody a long time to discover, create, find the language. And then also, if we think about it, if you are going against the rules around gender, which seem so scientifically based, or we've built entire systems. I mean, there are colors of Legos that girls are supposed to buy over what boys are supposed to buy. So there's a lot of investment in these ideas about gender. And if you are going against that, that's a risk. That's a danger. That's a stress. And so again, when you're thinking about those in your life and the communities that you seek to serve and how we can create a release through our allyship or through sharing our stories, if it's our personal story, and having that sense of belonging, that can be transformational. So then social gender or gender expression, on the unicorn here, that's those green dots. It's the way we communicate our gender to others through such things as clothing, hairstyle, and mannerisms. And again, this can have a lot of rules around it, a lot of norms. It's about the perception and interaction. And a lot of times when we're making a call about how we believe somebody, who they might be, we're making quick assumptions. So that's why we're going to get into here in a bit about some of the ways to use more inclusive language so we can assume less. It's natural that we're assuming. We're kind of wired to do that very quickly. There are ways that we can slow down. Okay. So the thing is that the expectations around gender, they're so rigid, as we talked about. We frequently are making those assumptions again on what someone wears or how they move and they talk, that's how they identify. But we need to slow down and pause there as well. Okay. So I hope that you're dropping in any questions that you might have. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And like I said, there's some resources here where you can learn more. They're in our packet. Because this is an evolving space. I mean, for myself as an ally, I'm not experiencing all the different things. I'm constantly reading and learning. And many times when I do presentations, I'm fortunate to have a committee on my board that reviews my presentations. And I had a trans woman who's on my board. She called me in to say, when you said this, it didn't really adequately explain it, or you missed the point, or it made me feel this way, because I also am growing. Okay, so how's this look? So this is my family. I just like to put my family slide on everything, but this is in 2015 when marriage equality was passing. And so Erin is my wife. She's cisgender, so she was assigned female at birth and identifies as a woman. She uses pronouns she, her. She uses terms like lesbian and queer, and she's white. And then there's me. And also, don't be surprised, I'm going to turn my camera on later, take the questions. Unfortunately, I have aged, or fortunately, but I've also aged. So my identity is exactly the same as Erin's, but the way that we move through space is really different. When Erin goes into the locker room, the restroom, orders a coffee, oftentimes people are making an assumption because she is masculine presenting. She identifies as a woman, but she's masculine presenting. She often gets called sir. And we'll talk about the ways that that's really built into our politeness. So pronouns. Do you have a pronoun? You do. Do you have an orientation? You do. Not only LGBT people have sexual orientations, and you have a gender identity, and you have ways that you seek to express that out to the rest of the world. So she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, he, him, his. Some people use they, them pronouns, and they may use they, them pronouns because they identify as non-binary. For non-binary people, it's different for each individual person, but in general, it could be one, because there isn't a binary. There's not just male or just female. Somebody could identify as neither of those genders, or they could identify as both. It could be more fluid. Not having a pronoun that is masculine or feminine fits best for that person. Some people you might see in their pronoun signatures, which you're probably seeing more of, they might say she, but they might also use they, them pronouns, which is also perfectly fine. We can get a little bit tied up on they, them pronouns, but here's the thing. When my son goes to a family's house to visit, and I don't know exactly maybe the gender of the kid that he's going to, I'll say, let me know when you get to their house. I might even just say that regardless if I know that it's, his friend Colin, who identifies as a boy, right? I'll say, let me know when you get to their house. So there's ways that we use they, them pretty regularly. And so it's not only for a plural. So what we're trying to do is that, remember that gender identity is not always apparent. Like if you think about my wife, Erin. And so how we perceive feminine or masculine, those are really rooted in those sexual norms, and we could make mistakes. So we want to listen. So we want to listen if we can hear how somebody introduces themselves or how somebody else refers. It's not 100% fail-safe. When I introduce myself with my pronouns, it makes it easier or more normal that you might introduce yourself with your pronouns. And while for me, I'm not often misgendered. I actually don't know if I've ever been misgendered, but my wife is. So how I'm going to show up as an ally for somebody who is misgendered often because of their gender expression, because maybe they're trans or non-binary, or maybe not, is when I do it, I take the pressure off of that person. Now, we don't want to force somebody. And another thing you want to avoid doing is if you think that somebody is trans, you don't be like, oh, tell me your pronouns, right? We want to make this kind of a universal norm. I often use this example of when I was at Antioch College. I hope there's some Antiochians on the call. But it was very common for us at this Tuesday meeting that I had, same meeting, same 12 people, I knew everybody very well. We would use our pronouns to introduce. A student 1 week used she, her pronouns. The next week they used they, them. And because we take a moment to introduce, put it in our email signatures, I was less likely to use the wrong pronoun for this person that I worked closely with and that I really respected. It doesn't mean that I didn't make mistakes along the way, but in that moment, because we all did it, it made it easier for that person to let us know, hey, I'm using different pronouns than I used to. It was a way to easily and like with no drama, just say, this is changing for me. We can also use gender neutral terms. You don't have to say ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, fine folks. Wonderful to see you all this evening. How may I help you? And it can be hard. I mean, we have a lot of chosen family. We have a lot of people that came into our son's life to be kind of aunts and uncles. And we used Miss and Mr. as a way of showing that respect. And it was my son who noticed that a friend of ours was transitioning, that they were changing how they appeared outwardly. They haven't told us yet what was going on or how their identity was, how they needed us to meet them or use different words. But he said, maybe I shouldn't call them Miss anymore, because maybe that won't make them feel like I love them and that I respect them as my auntie. Maybe it'll make them feel not seen. My son got that, and that was just because that's our norm. So this, it's like it can be in our politeness, in our culture. So it can be challenging, and we might have to take time to explain it and unpack it with people, right? Mistakes are going to be a part of life. And this goes back to anything that you've thought about maybe around unconscious bias. We have bias. We have ways of understanding the world. We're hardwired for it. It's what we do with it. It's the way that bias can get coupled with prejudice and power that creates structures and experiences that are harmful. So when I use the wrong pronoun for somebody, which I do, my most important thing to do is to validate, acknowledge first. Oh, thank you for correcting me. Validate that they're, there. You don't have to go over yourself, but I hear you and I'll work harder. And then you have to keep on learning. Another thing is if you know somebody's pronouns or their name has changed or how they might identify. If somebody's making an assumption about me, Amanda, that I'm married to a man, you can calmly just correct. Oh, actually, no, Amanda's wife, Erin. Or you can say, say you're talking about Erin. Oh, Erin uses she, her pronouns. We don't have to get on a soapbox. We don't have to make a big scene, because sometimes that could put the person who's experiencing that uncomfortable thing, who's experiencing that bias or that discrimination, and what could feel even more dangerous. So you have to know how to show up as an accomplice, how to be a co-conspirator. Sometimes it does require kind of a big way, but there's ways we can just correct each other. You can even pull somebody aside to say, hey, I heard you talking about Aaron and you made a mistake on their pronouns. I just wanted to make sure that you knew. So just some helpful tips as we bring this in for a close, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I hope that you are dropping some questions in there. So things to be mindful of in our work environment, in our teaching, and working with our constituents, with our community. Because I know some of you might be teachers, psychologists, food pantry, first responders, police officers. There's all different kinds of ways that you're going to be working with communities. Now, I will say this before I forget, I encourage you to partner with the other organizations in your community. If you're a predominantly white organization, how are you partnering with organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are maybe serving the same communities as you? There's something to learn there from those worldviews. There's assets within the communities that are suffering for how to solve those problems that you are also trying to solve. Sometimes we can make issues worse in the way that we're trying to fix them, right? Or the way that we're trying to bring relief. So partnerships are critically important. This is true for the LGBTQ community. So again, if you are wanting to make sure your workplace is responsive to somebody's gender coming out, to the transition, to what that process of being and living as their whole selves will look like and what it will require on their workplace, I highly encourage you to see if there's training or consultants that can walk you through that. So the pressure isn't just on a few people to try and find solutions, or the person going through that coming out process or that coming into themselves process. So be mindful of get to know you games. I always think about the get to know you game where everybody brings in a photo of themselves as a baby. Well, I've worked in a lot of predominantly white organizations. And I know for my Black and brown colleagues, that game is no fun. And a lot of times what I observe, also I'm a white person, you can't see me. So I observe as white people, when we're uncomfortable, you might make a joke of it. Oh, that's me. But we know that that's not you. And a lot of times we make that joke to make light of a situation that's uncomfortable, but then we're putting the burden on that person. So this would be true for somebody who's transgender. Some transgender people are absolutely comfortable with sharing photos of themselves when they were living as the sex or gender assigned at birth. Some are not. It could be extremely painful for them. So they're not really going to be able to participate in this game, and we're not getting to know or creating a sense of belonging. Even for my wife, if she were to bring in childhood photos, I mean, she used to wear clothes that were girl clothes, I'm doing quotes here, you know. She used to wear and have aesthetics that presented what we believe the expectation, the gender norms are around being a woman. And so a lot of times there's a joke that's made about that, oh, you are so cute in a dress, you should wear one again. That really undermines, like, what's wrong with how she dresses? So we want to be mindful of that. Of course, Halloween. Like, we need to not culturally misappropriate and dress up as cultures and communities that are not ours, because again, there tends to be this way that that's making a joke. Similar, if cross-dressing was a part of a Halloween costume, how could that make somebody who is trans feel? Are you making a joke about them? Are you playing on these stereotypes of gender, of masculinity or femininity in a way? Or for somebody who's more genderqueer is a term that my wife might use, right? She just kind of bends the rules of how women are supposed to look and dress. So let's not create that as something that we're bringing into our workplace or into our events. When somebody has changed their name, don't ask what their real name is. And once you know their name, and it's a quote unquote real, the real name is the name that somebody tells you to call them. So if you used to know that somebody's name was Sarah, but now it's Sam, you might make mistakes, especially if you've known that person for a long time. But again, you need to acknowledge that mistake. I tell people practice. Practice. If you know you might make a mistake in interacting with somebody around their pronouns or their name, maybe the name is unfamiliar to you because it's not. The syllables, the sounds, the phonetics of that name are unfamiliar to you for your own cultural reasons. Practice it. so that you're not having to make up a nickname for that person, embarrass that person, ask them to over and over again say it to you. So practice. And we want to avoid these backhanded compliments. So you're so pretty for a girl, or I didn't know that you were trans, or if I was gay, I would date you. Gay people are so much more fun. So these are these backhanded kind of compliments. And a lot of times what they're doing is they're deeply steeped in stereotypes of how a certain group is supposed to act. And while there sometimes can be kernels of truth within a stereotype, we know that a stereotype erases the individuality of people and can be completely harmful and not true for that individual, and oftentimes not true for in a community. So some small steps that we can take. We want to include, where we can, the option of selecting our pronouns. So we want to include the pronoun they, them. I really encourage this over even including titles. We've moved away from using Mr. and Mrs. on our titles, so why not replace it with pronouns? Then you know how somebody wants to be, what pronouns they use. It's not their preference, it's not their preferred pronoun, it is just their pronoun. Identities are not preferences, they're not choices. Even if language and how comfortable we are and how we communicate that outward shifts over time and can appear to be a choice, it's, again, integral to people's sense of self. And then how do you update that over time? I do have those handouts here that show some really good ways that you can create a workplace, a program that is responsive to transitioning. So it doesn't put all the work on the individual transitioning, rather your program, your organization is responsive. And again, get practice with using it in your intros, put it in your signature line. And if it's in your email signature line, brand it, make sure it's on brand. Bring your marketing and communications and HR departments along with it. Now, I don't have an HR department, so maybe it's somebody on your board. Maybe you're having to research those on best practices. And then explain and bring people along as to why that you're doing that. It's very useful to have a list of resources for learning and support. And often I think about this too with things with regards to domestic violence support, to mental health, right? So for people within the LGBTQ community, accessing those services because of discrimination, because we might not be taken seriously, because we're afraid of experiencing a social worker that doesn't understand what a same gender relationship looks like, there can be barriers to that. So know where to make referrals for your community and for your employees. And then there's national kind of hotlines and stuff that we should just make available to anybody in HR. The other part of it is that it might be where you're helping to show up for somebody is because they're a parent or a loved one of somebody who's LGBTQ, and finding that resource that for them specifically can help them care for their loved one. And then, celebrating heritage months, including Pride, is great. There's gender inclusive bathrooms and policies, and this is a place where we see a lot of legislation. The main rule of thumb here is people really just want to go to the bathroom. Just like that book, Everybody Poops, like literally everybody does need to go to the bathroom and has biological needs. And people want to go to the restroom where they're most safe and comfortable. That's the rule of thumb. And people should go to the restroom with which they identify. And so one thing that you can do is if you have single stall restrooms, a lot of times we see men's room, women's room, but it's literally a door that closes and locks behind it with one sink and toilet. You can just make that a restroom. You can just make that a bathroom. And then if you're a place like a museum where I used to work, you want to make sure you let people know there's multi-stall restrooms on the first floor and there's single stall restrooms on the second floor. I will tell you that my wife and I, when we're in public, we look for those single stalls because we've had really bad experiences in the women's restroom before. People just have that bias and that knee-jerk reaction, and we want to do more education around that, but the fact of the matter is, who wants to be uncomfortable? Going to the public restroom is already not good enough. Not a good experience. So review your dress code policies. Do you have very specific gender terms? I read a policy recently that actually required women to wear skirts and pantyhose. So then Erin would not be complying with the dress code, and that could be a fireable offense, right? Or that could be something she could get written up with. Is that really something that you want to implement? So let's pay attention to what our dress codes are. So some deeper work, again, is what are your healthcare benefits that you are providing? What would be your plan if I were to come out as a lesbian? What is your plan around that? What support do you have? How are you going to help me inform other people? How are you going to help me deal with somebody who maybe says jokes and comments that make me feel really uncomfortable? What are your plans or ways that you can show up and support and have a good game plan in place for somebody who's going to be transitioning on the job? This is one of the things I think about. The privilege I have, there's a lot more acceptance for me as a lesbian, and I'm white, and I kind of look like what people think a woman should look like. So I have a lot of privilege in that. When somebody is transgender, they've known for a long time who they are. Their process of coming into that outwardly, it's like on full display, sometimes for years, as that comes together for them. As they come into themselves, their names, they change, and let alone all the legal things that might be happening in order for their credit cards to have their new name, in order, if they're even allowed in your state, to change their gender marker on their birth certificate. And so that requires investment. You can look at these resources that I have here, but you want to bring somebody in who can guide you through that. You can always go to the people in your community and in your organization that are living that experience. But just like it's not the job of a Black person to teach all white people about everything racism, yes, involve people, listen, but it's not their job on top of their job, or it's not their work on top of coming to your class or receiving your service. So you want to be inclusive, but you don't want to tokenize and put that work on them. And I always want to encourage people to be responsive to time off policies. You know, if you have a bereavement policy that allows 3 days off for an immediate family member, well, technically, Cheryl is as much my mother as my mother, Christine, who gave birth to me. And if Cheryl were to pass and you were only going to give me 3 days off, that would be devastating to me because of that chosen family. You know? And so do you have a responsive time off policy? Do you have around bereavement, around being able to take care of loved ones? And then again, always that reminder that there's no one right way to come out. So I'm going to bring us in for a landing here. I'm a little bit over on time. Let's see. So again, not all transgender people place the word trans in front of their gender, and that is okay. Some trans people are stealth. So the inclusion of transgender or trans as a gender identity, like on a form or something, I think that would be wonderful. It would be great. But the problem is there's still so much discrimination, especially for the transgender community, that it's unlikely that checking off that box would feel safe. We know that we want all the boxes. We know that we need to ask about race, but we know because of racism, checking that box does not always feel safe or good for somebody who's a person of color, let alone that the options there might not actually get to who they totally are. But here's a little bit of an example of ways that on an application form, maybe on survey forms, that you can start to expand on gender identity, including non-binary. If you're able to include an open field box that says self-identify, I know that's more work for us on the back end of data, but it is more inclusive. Putting those pronouns there, she, her, he, him, they, them. There's other pronouns. There's lots of words that we've created that are might be a pronoun that somebody uses. So you can have that self-identify there. With titles, MX is a gender inclusive term, and it said mix. So MX could be something that you place if you do want to ask for titles. As I mentioned in my blog, I really encourage people to drop titles, because even for just a same gender couple like my wife and I, there's not one of us who's like, I'm technically the Mrs., but like then she's the Miss, and like also, I don't know. It just doesn't really work for us. And a lot of times she's called Mrs. Cole, but Cole is her maiden name, right? So you can also ask for people's chosen name. This allows for people to put a nickname in there. And then if you're having to do background checks, what might happen for somebody who's trans? This could be a real moment of stress for them, because when you do a background check, you might find other names and other gender markers that do not match their true identity and how they are living and applying for this job or trying to do this work. I mean, that is something that people experience every time they're pulled over, for instance. So what you could do is you can say, other legal names. It allows that person to put the other legal name in there, and you can put these disclaimers, used for background check purposes only, and this is held confidential, and then really do hold it confidential. And you can also put these other disclaimers around personal identification where you can acknowledge, hey, this might not match your gender identity or the name used on the application, and basically that's okay. So these are also ways, and especially for younger generations, that you're signifying and cueing that you are doing the work to be an inclusive workplace. And the last thing, I always just think where you can add more options around family to remove gender denotations where possible. So instead of mother and father, use parent one and parent two. And I'll also say from a blended family perspective, my son had 2 sets of parents. So it would have just been nice to be able to have more options of where to put that and not regulate my wife to the corner of the form. So again, here are some of these resources that I found very useful and I go to time and time again from some of the leading organizations, nonprofit organizations, and then also Ernst & Young is a corporate organization that has a good policy. Now that might be a little bit larger, probably, as it's a multinational company, than your organization, but there are some good takeaways from there. And here's my contact information. So I know we're going to try and get in some questions, but I'm here to be a resource. I'm here to kind of, take any of your questions and help in any way I can and help to make referrals, especially if you're in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio. I know the lay of the land pretty well.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Oh boy. There's a lot of great questions and a lot of I think anytime we have these conversations, because the language is so important and sort of new, we're getting a lot of kind of corrections or
Oh, great.
So for instance, you just said maiden name and
Yeah.
someone said, hey, watch the language, and I'm kind of curious
Yeah.
myself, what do you say rather than maiden name?
So first, usually when I'm more interactive with people, I ask them to use the chat to correct me and to share other better ways and different ways of knowing. So thank you for the person who put that in there. I don't know. What does somebody use? I hadn't really thought about it in that way. So I really appreciate that that was dropped into the chat. I guess you could probably say, born name, because we're talking about last name, or family name. Family name would probably be the better one. Yeah.
Family name. Yeah. So I kind of, I wanted to pose that or say that because like you said, we're all learning and this can feel very new. So I like that. I think family name sounds great. So let's dig into some of these questions. They're just kind of, I was hoping to maybe categorize them or something, but there are a lot all over. So Maggie says, I'm a fundraiser at a nonprofit. I have done a decent job of moving us away from gendered language in our communications, i.e., ladies and gentlemen. However, I still have some pushback on using salutations in the informal letters, so Ms., Mr., Mrs. Many of my direct supervisors feel it's more respectful. I have done most of our mailings just by addressing the first name with growing pains. Is there a gender neutral option for formal letters? And I think you sort of addressed this, but go ahead and let us know.
So it really does depend on your organization. And so depending on your database, here's what I like to do. If your donor base is small enough, you can find out how people want to be acknowledged. If they want Mr. and Mrs. or Mr. and Mrs. or whatever those titles might be, that more formal salutation, if you can find out from them, maybe starting with your major donors first, because that's usually where our greater concern. We don't see that as much on our larger direct mail and annual giving campaigns. A lot of times those can feel a little less formal. Then find out, and I always try to keep my salutation field like in Razor's Edge updated and make sure I mail merge that in. So if you can do that, that would be great. I do also think in letters, like when we say dear, that already sets a more kind of respectful and formal tone. And the way that I would continue just to make this case is to say, this has to do with younger people of all orientations. We just know that generations are shifting and are tending not to be married, are tending to have different partnerships. And so we just want to avoid making those kind of mistakes. And then that also goes into, of course, around orientation and the unique ways that a same gender loving couple the salutation, the title fields might not match up. And then again, let alone if somebody is non-binary or trans and they haven't made us aware of that, well, that's one less way that we can use a gendered term and possibly create distance or even with our organization or make them feel disrespected.
Okay, thank you so much. We've gotten this question in a couple of different ways, so I think this might cover a few people's question. Crystal says, if someone has told you their pronouns, but they haven't shared with others, what is the best way to address them to others without, sort of outing, in quotes, them, but also respecting their pronouns?
Yep, this is such a good question. It's really important that if somebody comes out to you, whether that's around orientation or identity, it can be, if you don't remember in that moment, it can be great to circle around and say, what do you want me to do with this information? I am here for you, but I need you to let me know how I should hold this information. If I should hold it as confidential, I'm going to need you to help coach me. So really in your one-on-one interactions, in your personal and private interactions, I would say not even at work, like if you're the only two people in the break room. I know I'm using this example and we're not even in the break room, but you know what I mean. I would probably even avoid using their pronouns that they told you there so that you're not overheard, but you should just really ask and try and follow their lead. Now, when they are out about that and they've told other people, you might want to check in again and say, okay, how can I be the best accomplice with you? How can I be the best ally? And that is where I do find the simple corrections are very helpful. So we really want to follow them on this way. So I will say I was recently in that kind of situation where I knew somebody's new name and their pronouns, but they are informing people in different segments. So I work with them in my organizational capacity, and at the company that they're at, they're not out there. They haven't made that change. They haven't shown up to work as their self yet. But in the social situation, they are out. So I kind of have to flip in between. And so I slow down and I take care. So I refer to them by their birth name, which is technically now going to be their dead name, the name they no longer use, in a formal email when I'm addressing them as an executive director to the role they have at this other organization. But when I'm talking about them with other friends that know, I use their name and I use their pronoun. So you do have to be careful. If you're not going to be able to make that switch, I would just let that person know until you're all the way out. I'm going to stay with your old name and your own old pronoun. How do you feel about that? Because I don't want to out you on accident.
Thank you so much. Daniel says, what are appropriate ways to inquire about gender and pronouns when onboarding?
Yeah, I think this is still a field where we are learning. And so what I like to see, what is best, is if your organization has it as a norm that everybody shares their pronouns, so we're not singling anybody out. And the way that I would do that on the onboarding, and I think the Transgender Law Center has a great example, and so does HRC, because you have to think about, is it on your name badges? When you're doing in-person events again, is it on the name tag where people can write in their pronouns? Is it in your signature line? Is it on your Zoom call? And it should be, and there should be some education that goes along with that. And so you just want to say, hey, we really work to be inclusive, and so my pronouns are she, her. What are your pronouns? And somebody might not understand that, and so you might want to explain. We just don't want to make assumptions, and we know that this improves communication, so that's why I'm asking. And you can also say, I understand if you don't know how to answer or don't want to answer, that's okay. It's just one of the ways that we really try to improve communication. But we should bring people along. So we've been doing so many Zoom calls and trainings where we just introduce on our pronouns, that our board and our staff are trying to have just a real quick kind of elevator speech about, hey, I just use my pronouns, here's why. So that would be that best option. I just would like to see pronouns, at least the 3, on all of our forms and our survey forms, and it just could make it a little bit more normal. And then we're not wanting to ask about orientation, but we're wanting our onboarding and our any forms associated with that to be gender neutral, so that it doesn't feel awkward when somebody is writing in who their partner is, if their partner is same gender.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask you a bit of a longer question, and as you think about that, I'll tell our audience about what's going on with Candid in the future. So Rebecca says, cross-dressing. Your guidance
Mhm.
about cross-dressing seems to contradict the transgressive power of drag. Could you say more about why you caution against cross-dressing at Halloween? Are there only some folks who are allowed to exaggerate sex and gender stereotypes? Who are the gatekeepers, if so? So I'll let you think about that while I just let everyone know we have a couple of great programs coming up. So if you'd like to experience one of our virtual workshops, as well as join Lori Villarosa, who's gonna, from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, she's gonna have a conversation about the frameworks of racial equity, racial justice, and grant seeking with Michelle Morales of the Woods Funds of Chicago and Castle Redmond of the California Endowment. So we invite you to join us on March 30th. That's one of our $10 topics. We'll also be hosting a live webinar next week, March 31st, in which you can find out how to involve your management team in your fundraising and impact measurement efforts, so you're all working together to ensure long-term sustainability and successful fundraising. So back to the very long question about cross-dressing.
A very good
And
question. Yeah.
yes, great question.
Yeah. I love it. So I'm trying to think about this. So one, drag is an art form, and it can be performed by anybody, regardless of their gender identity. So a cis woman can perform in feminine drag or could perform in masculine drag, for instance, as an example. It is playing on, and in its roots is a defiance to these gender stereotypes of what is allowed and not allowed. So it's really layered and political. And also, I'm just giving some background here for folks, and also really rose in a time when we were policed and you know, seen as perverts and delinquents and all these different elements. So that's me saying that, not being a member of the drag community, but more, but only as an audience member. So there's that part of it. I do know, and I've had conversations with trans women, not all of them, again, because what one person might feel comfortable with or their understanding could be different than something I'm saying here. But I have had conversations where some trans women feel that drag is making fun of them, is collapsing the nuance and complexity of their gender identity. We also know that there's been lots of conversations within the queer community, also queer being a word that I use, but that isn't always as readily used by straight people because it still is a derogatory term. But just for purposes of here, within this broader queer LGBT community and drag community, how racism, you know, brown and blackface has shown up in drag at times, and how there can be a tendency to be extremely transphobic. So while a cis man is dressed up in drag and performing in a feminine manner, there have been times where that, in that persona, that person takes a shot at and says negative things about trans people. So that is work that is absolutely having to happen within the drag scene, community, performers, and also within the queer community. So it's certainly not linear, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be checked again around the racism and transphobia that happens. Now, Halloween is not somebody coming, in my opinion, to an office party for Halloween dressed up as a boy or dressed up as a girl is not seeking to challenge stereotypes, is not reaching back, is unlikely to, I would say, reaching back into deep performative aspects of, you know, radical resistance. And also to say, you know, trans women can also be drag queens. Somebody can be identified as a woman and be a drag queen. Somebody can be identified as a man, whether they're cisgender or a transgender man, and also participate in drag, because drag is, again, the amped up play on. So I just think that if I show up and you know, dress in masculine clothing, how might I make a trans man feel, or somebody who is masculine presenting and genderqueer like my wife? Might they feel like I'm taking a shot and making fun of them? And kind of going back to the way that when we're uncomfortable with something, we kind of make a joke about it. So I would just avoid having that kind of experience at all. Now, if your organization is going to have a drag show, a drag time story hour, you know, a drag bingo, maybe a drag performer at an event, great. I mean, I think that that's wonderful. But you should also think about and pay attention to the drag performers that you're bringing in, where you can, and get connections from within the community to make sure that that performer isn't known for or participating in transphobic and homophobic issues. And if you have LGBTQ folks that are a part of your community and your organization, just ask us and get a sense of what we think about that performer, or if it's a good thing to do. There is a way that drag has kind of been commodified. It's something that straight people feel comfortable with about queer culture, and they pay money and they go to our clubs to see it, which can be a really great part of allyship and kind of acceptance. But it can minimize and just unfortunately perpetuate stereotypes about the LGBTQ community, and it can kind of take away the empowerment. I mean, there's parallels that we could draw along other cultural art forms that become, you know, popular with the mainstream or become popular with white people, and then the way that that kind of can remove the power, the agency, or the ownership from which that original art form came from within that minority community. And minority meaning that we're a smaller part of the or that we're marginalized, not just racial as in racial minority. Did I get to that? I mean, I just want to pull this person into the room so we can talk, because also it's something that, like I said, we're grappling with, and I think a lot about, especially after I got pulled aside by one of our members who's a trans woman, and she was like, yeah, I bet this drag performer is great, but here's how it makes me feel. So how important is it for you to have this at your event if it makes me feel this way? And we just leaned in on that conversation.
Wow. Yeah, there's definitely a lot to consider. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Andrea wants you to explain the ZIE, ZIR pronouns. This is her first time seeing, or this is their first time seeing
Yeah.
these. And also, what is the best practice for keeping abreast of the inclusive language that is constantly evolving?
Yeah. So first for you, Yvonne, good catch
Mhm.
there, right? So,
Thank you.
right, right. So we did the
Yeah,
thing where we can hear a certain name and we're like, oh, that
right.
means that's this. And then you're like, oh, wait,
Exactly.
I actually don't know. So Yvonne really modeled the way that when you don't know someone's pronouns, you can use they, them. And then the thing to do is when somebody lets you know what their pronouns are, you get to know them, use their pronouns so they're not feeling objectified, because they can feel like those people in the way that we know that term can be othering. But
Yep.
when
Others.
we don't know, do it. So great job there. Look at
Thank you.
look at both of us just learning.
Right.
Yeah. So they, zir, za. They're just gender, as far as my understanding of those words and many other words, is that they're gender neutral. They're gender inclusive, and they are used by anybody really can use them, but and they also have really come from within the trans and non-binary community as far as language goes. And again, in the chat, anybody can drop other resources or a correction there. You know, Google is helpful. So, I mean, I'm not saying that to be, you know, snarky or anything, but I do go there. I have not had many people that I'm interacting with who are using these new terms. I'm mostly hearing they, them, there, but I think that that's because it's easiest to use. So, they, theirs, is similar, and I hope that I'm saying that correct. but I have to go and look constantly. And I think that a good first step is just to at least include they, them, and on gender identity to at least include non-binary.
Okay, thank
There's
you.
other terms, sorry, there's other terms in addition to non-binary that we also use, which are gender expansive and gender queer. But again, queer can be a difficult term and shouldn't turn up in your forms and whatnot unless you're a very radical queer organization and then your constituents are different. But for the most part, that word is probably not going to be well received. Like I would think that, like, it's what I use for my identity, but it shouldn't probably be on a form unless, again, like I said, if you're a LGBT serving organization, I'm going to expect to see it on your form.
Okay, thank you. So Rod asked this question, and my response, immediately was like, "What?" And I didn't know if I wanted to ask, but you may have a really nice way to address this. So,
Uh-huh.
um, Rod says, "How would you handle a staff member referring to a non-binary child as your whatever?"
Oh, that's extremely not okay. So
Right.
that, right. So how would I respond? Well, first, I would want to check in with the person directly affected. I would want to say either to them or email, probably to them, depending on the relationship. I heard what this person said to you, and that's not okay. And within my position or whatever, I want to do something, but I want to check in with you about that. Again, we want to check with people first because maybe they're not ready for you to do that. And you can even say it doesn't have to be today. It could be sometime, but I don't want to make things more difficult for you. I want to hear your strategies. And also just going to somebody to say that wasn't okay. That's important. If I'm a supervisor in that situation of both people, then it is within my ability to correct that, to correct language. That's what we're doing a lot of times, our tone and how we speak to people and the way in which we approach our relationships. So of course I would take that person aside and then I would probably reach out to the other person to say, we always want to go back to those I statements, right? When I heard you say this, it upset me. It felt really disrespectful. And I think that it hurt and embarrassed that other person that you said that to. Also, you're talking about their child. I mean, let anybody say something like that about my child. I'm just gonna, again, my camera, unfortunately, I tried to put it on so y'all could see my face, but hopefully through my voice, you can see my face. Let somebody. Because here's the thing. You don't call people out their name. We call people by their names. It's just respectful. So you just might want to, and you could even say that. I would say, if you did that to me about my child, I would be really upset, So then you also want to get curious. Can you tell me more about why you did that? Maybe they're just like, I got tongue-tied. I didn't know what to say, or, this makes me really uncomfortable. You can have a moment, hopefully, where they can get vulnerable. Because here's the fact of the matter. People do get uncomfortable around sexual orientation and gender identity. They get uncomfortable around trans and non-binary and gender expansive identities because these social norms about gender, they're hundreds of years old. They're really old. And then also for that person, it might be rooted in other cultural aspects, family culture, religious culture, national, ethnic, racial culture that says what those norms are. So they could be having a really difficult growing edge. So you can bring them in and be curious about that. It could also just be that that person doesn't care enough about that relationship to be respectful. So then you just want to bring it back to what your core values and mission and expectations are for how people are treated. And you can tell them that is not okay. From here, you're put on notice, their child's pronouns are X and their child's name is this, right? And so that's what I expect for you to hear. That's how I would approach it.
Yeah, and I think the question, or at least the way I was thinking, it was like, yeah, how would you handle it, Amanda?
Well, how I handle it on this training versus how I handle it in real life might be a little different. But no, and the other thing is, like, we do want to give people a degree of the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
We want to give that person who made that egregious mistake the opportunity, you want to hold space that they might not have known better, that they might not have been trying to do harm, that they might be extremely uncomfortable, and you have an opportunity for learning. But again, people only get that chance so many times. And we can apply this to race. We know that there's ways of talking about race or referring to people who are not white in ways that are extremely othering and delimiting and erase them as a person. And so again, people can only do that so many times before then it's just a habit, or they're showing that they don't care about the norms of inclusion and allowing people to belong.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you and I talked about this a little bit. This question, Michaela says, I'm wondering if you can speak on this, how to balance raising awareness and education about LGBTQ topics in the workplace without tokenizing or isolating LGBTQ peers, or kind of putting them on the spot.
Yep.
I often feel it's a challenge to meet staff where they are in their ally journey while also providing information that feels helpful or
Yeah.
relevant to LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So what I see organizations do really well, like we work with a number of organizations that are large enough that they have employee resource groups. And those are affinity groups built around, I mean, there's employee resource groups for caretakers, whether they're caretaking for elders or young people. There's affinity groups for veterans, African American, Asian, Hispanic, women, whatnot. So if you're an organization that is large enough that you could consider an employee resource group model, you can research on that, you can reach out to me. From that, you can really have a group of LGBTQ folks and allies who can help to drive your learning, educational programs and opportunities. And it's going to be more organic. There's going to be empowerment and agency with that. Of course, be mindful that you are likely asking people most directly affected by bias and discrimination and oppression to do additional work. We know this is often the case for brown and black folks in workplaces, for BIPOC people, that they are also having to then teach and deal with it. So put resources behind it. And I think that if you're a decision maker, you can ask people, you can poll in a survey that is anonymous, depending on your work culture. You could have one-on-one meetings or a focus group to say, what are the things that would make our organization feel like a place that you really want to be at every single day. And you can make it broad-based. It doesn't have to just be about LGBTQ. There's other quality of life and things of that nature that really affect all of us. And like, even when I think about time off policies and dress code policies, those don't only benefit LGBTQ folks. They're just unique ways that is responsive to how our community tends to take shape. So it can be challenging. I mean, it can be challenging to sit through as somebody really processes out their understanding and asks awkward questions. So some basic tips around that is, and this is true around racial equity training, ability training, sexism, those things, is to schedule them at times and encourage maybe people to keep their schedule open an hour afterwards so they can get a break and decompress. It's really hard if you know that your colleague is trying to be an ally, but they just said something that was like really triggering. Somebody else had said to you that was really harmful at some time in your life, and now you have to go into a meeting. So you can create an organizational culture that allows for time. I mean, also many times people don't always want a pay increase as much as they just want more time off. So how can you really encourage people to have a 30-minute or an hour break after a training? I think working with organizations that are led by, that are led by the community that you're trying to help raise awareness around. And then also, we do a lot of trainings with organizations, and we really encourage them to include things like sharing our stories by using the StoryCorps out loud, because there is something in there for LGBTQ folks. When I sit there and I hear other people's stories, even if it's not mine that's saying, it makes me feel seen. It makes me feel visible. I know people have been having courageous conversations where they're creating a space for Black, Indigenous, people of color within the organization to share their experiences, often of discrimination or oppression. And again, you need to make sure that there's space that those people can take care of themselves if you're doing that from within your organization. But for the most part, I mean, we still find that LGBTQ, sexual orientation and gender identity, especially around trans identity and issues, there can just be some pushback to organizations even wanting to talk about that because it's seen as too political. Because the fact of the matter is there's a lot of anti-discrimination legislation and policies that 28 states, we don't have protection. So unfortunately, our lives have been politicized because there's laws that go against us. So for the most part, for me, if you are doing some kind of training, you're signifying that you're wanting to make it safer and more welcoming for me. I don't know. I
Wow.
listed off a lot of different things. Yeah.
Yeah, this is hard. There's so many questions. I'm going to ask this final one because speaking of being seen, I don't know that we've touched upon this at all. Patrick says, I'm a Native American Two-Spirit, and for many of us First Nations Two-Spirits, our gender reality is not merely based on the physiological or mental perceptions of self or others, but more fundamentally spiritual. So why is the spiritual dimension of who we are as LGBTQ people ignored?
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really great point. You said Patrick, what's her name?
Yes.
And Patrick, my question also to you then, for me as a practitioner, maybe you can email me, is I have went back and forth about including Two-Spirit as an option. And I want to include it. And then there's a part of me that gets nervous as a white person about cultural misappropriation of Two-Spirit, because it's more than just a checkbox, as all identity is. So that was something that I'd be interested to be in dialogue with you about as I do these performances or presentations. So yeah, I don't know. So, well, in one part, it's an hour. I don't even know how to adequately bring people along on challenging the fact that a binary isn't real, and that part of our identity isn't real, let alone finding ways to be able to get into conversations around our spirituality and the deep interconnectedness of our spiritual selves, our spirit selves, and the way that that connects in with our identity development and things like the mind and body connection and psychology. So this also comes up for me when we're talking about like religious beliefs in more dominant religions like Christianity, for instance. I often struggle with how do we broach that subject about how we can create existences of coexisting experiences where somebody's religious rights and freedoms, they might feel infringed on because I want to exist, and I feel infringed on because they want to exist. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know, but I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a really important part of this. And especially as what you're bringing from, an Indigenous perspective, that it's missing in a lot of different places within our organizations, I would imagine you would probably say, is the lack of recognition of spiritual and energetic selves. So I don't know, if you want to email me, I would love to be in more conversation with you.
Yes, absolutely. It sounds like, as always, anytime we meet, we're just scratching the surface. So I just want to thank you so much and make sure we end at least a little bit on time. Thank you again, Amanda. And I want to thank everyone for being here. I appreciate your expert and insights with us today, Amanda. I know that it's a lot. And everyone who was here, thank you all for taking time out of your day to join our conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.